Hey there, tonight's story might not soothe you right away, but it will pull you in. This isn't a tale of gods on their thrones or heroes in shining armor. It's about the things that made them tremble, the beasts, the curses, the nightmares that haunted the edges of ancient Greece, and sometimes wandered straight through the middle of it. If this kind of storytelling helps you relax, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly helps you drift off, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. There's something oddly comforting about knowing who else is wandering through mythology at this hour. So, dim the lights, pull the blankets closer, and let us begin with the most terrifying monsters in Greek mythology. Settle in now, let the day dissolve into dusk. The flickering shadows on your walls are just that, shadows. That low rumble you hear in the distance? Merely the wind, right? Nothing to worry about. Certainly not the stirring of something ancient, something immense enough to block out the stars. But if you were an ancient Greek, you'd be less certain. You'd hear that sound and shiver, knowing full well that the world you lived in, with its orderly Olympus and polished marble columns, was only the surface. Beneath it, lurking, was something monstrous, something that made even the gods tremble. And at the very bottom of that bestiary, lounging like a volcano on its day off, was Typhon. Typhus, or Typhus if you prefer his more dramatic stage name, was no minor menace. He was, in essence, the apocalypse with scales, a living storm, a force of nature that could bring everything crashing down. He was the end of everything, wrapped in darkness and fury. Now, picture this, a creature whose very presence would make the earth quake, whose breath would scorch the air, and whose eyes glowed with an anger so fierce even the gods had to pause and reconsider their existence. Typhon was no mere beast, he was chaos incarnate. His body stretched endlessly toward the sky, his limbs covered in scales that shimmered like molten lava. Hundreds of serpent heads hissed from his shoulders, each one ready to strike, and from his monstrous frame wings the size of entire mountains unfurled, casting shadows across the world below. If you're imagining a creature that would make even Zeus sweat a little, then you're on the right track. Historians still argue whether Typhon represented the sheer untamable power of nature or was simply the personification of destruction itself. Some say he was Gaia's ultimate weapon, an embodiment of vengeance after the gods had done her wrong. Others suggest Typhon was the embodiment of the catastrophic forces that could dismantle even the gods' lofty world. Either way, he wasn't a threat you could ignore. His very name echoed across the ages, a warning that the earth had a pulse, and it was one that could wipe away everything you held dear in an instant. As you imagine Typhon rising from the depths of the earth, remember that the ancient Greeks believed these monsters weren't just stories. They were real, tangible threats, lurking just beyond the veil of the known world. And Typhon, in all his terrifying glory, was the embodiment of that fear. Fear of the unknown, of the uncontrollable, and of the dark forces that could return at any moment. As you settle deeper into the dark, let the echo of Typhon's terrifying image linger in your mind. But don't get too comfortable, there's much more to come. Our next creature isn't some monster from the far reaches of myth. No, this one was very real, at least for anyone unlucky enough to cross her path. We're talking about Medusa, the Gorgon. Medusa wasn't always the terrifying figure we know today, the one with snakes for hair and a gaze that could turn anyone to stone. She started life as a beautiful maiden, a priestess of Athena, the goddess of wisdom and warfare. In fact, she was so stunning that she became the object of affection for many suitors, including the sea god Poseidon. It was in Athena's temple that Poseidon pursued Medusa, and in an act that would forever alter her fate, the two gods shared a moment of passion there. Historians still argue whether Medusa's transformation into a monster was an act of justice or cruelty. Was Athena, in her wrath, punishing Medusa for the sin of lust? Or was she acting to protect Medusa from further abuse, transforming her into something untouchable by the gods or mortal men? One view suggests that Medusa's beauty was always meant to be a tool of temptation, an irresistible force in a world where gods and mortals alike were driven by desire. Medusa, in this view, is a tragic figure, punished not just for her beauty, but for the way it provoked divine jealousy. Whatever the reasoning, Medusa's transformation was nothing short of horrific. Athena, enraged by Poseidon's violation of her sacred space, cursed Medusa, changing her into a Gorgon. Her once beautiful locks became living snakes, each wriggling and hissing as if alive. Her gaze, once capable of captivating hearts, became lethal. Anyone who looked her directly in the eyes was immediately turned to stone. This was a cruel and complete transformation. Medusa, the goddess' beloved priestess, was no longer a symbol of beauty and purity, but a symbol of terror and isolation. She was cast out from the world, condemned to live alone in a faraway cave, away from the gaze of the world she had once belonged to. Her beauty, once a gift, had become her curse, and now every living thing that laid eyes on her would fall victim to her rage. But her story doesn't end there. Medusa became a haunting figure in the minds of many, and for centuries she was remembered as a monster, a killer of heroes, her legend growing with each passing year. To some, Medusa's transformation was a tragic twist of fate, while to others it was simply the inevitable result of divine punishment. The ancient Greeks used her image as both a shield and a warning. Her face was used as an apotropaic symbol, the Gorgon's face placed on shields, armor, and doorways as a protective charm to ward off evil. The same gaze that turned men to stone was believed to protect the living from other threats. It's almost poetic in its irony, isn't it? The very force that was used to punish her would later be transformed into an emblem of defense. However, Medusa's legacy isn't just about her transformation. It's about the deep-seated fears that lurk within human nature. The Greeks, like many cultures, had an intense fear of the unknown, of what could not be understood or controlled, and Medusa, with her monstrous form and power, represented that very fear. She was a being who existed outside the realm of reason, beyond the control of the gods, whose transformation symbolized the ultimate loss of humanity. She was no longer a woman, but a force of nature. Her very presence a reminder of how fragile the gods' control over the world really was. Scholars still debate whether Medusa was truly a villain or simply a victim of the gods' whims. Some argue that Medusa's transformation into a monster wasn't just a punishment, but a way for her to reclaim some agency in a world where men and gods continuously sought to control her. Her eyes, the very thing that made her a monster, became the most powerful weapon she could wield. A power to control her own fate, even if it meant cursing all those who came near her. This dark irony, the tragic yet empowering nature of Medusa's curse, makes her one of the most complex figures in Greek mythology. When the hero Perseus was sent on a quest to slay Medusa, he was given gifts from the gods: winged sandals from Hermes, a reflective shield from Athena, and a sword from Hephaestus. Armed with these divine tools, Perseus was able to approach Medusa without directly looking at her and decapitate her while she slept. But even in death, Medusa's legacy endured. From her blood sprang forth the winged horse Pegasus and the giant Chrysaor, both born from the union of Medusa and Poseidon. It was as though the monster she had become could never truly be destroyed, only repurposed. Even in her death, Medusa's existence was tied to creation and destruction. Her image, once feared, became iconic. From ancient pottery to modern-day cinema, Medusa's face continues to haunt the imagination. Artists have grappled with her identity, trying to decipher whether she was a victim of circumstances or a figure of power and vengeance. And still, she remains one of the most enduring symbols of the dark side of beauty, of how appearance can be both a gift and a curse. She reminds us that what we perceive on the outside can often hide something far darker beneath the surface. In Medusa's case, that darkness was a tragic tale of divine retribution, but it also gave her the power to shape her own fate, however terrible it may have been. In the end, Medusa represents the complexities of beauty, desire, and the wrath of the gods. She is both a victim and a villain, a reflection of the ancient Greek understanding of divine retribution, but also a symbol of the kind of power that arises from being cast aside, from being abandoned by those who were once meant to protect you. And as you lie here tonight, think about how Medusa, a woman once blessed with beauty and grace, became a reminder of how revenge and power can turn anyone into a monster, no matter how pure they may have once been. By now, you've encountered Typhon's monstrous fury and Medusa's tragic transformation, but as you continue to sink into the shadows, the horrors of Greek mythology only grow darker. It's time to meet a creature that was not just terrifying, but cunning, an ancient puzzle of death wrapped in labyrinthine complexity. We're talking about the Minotaur. Now, let's be clear, the Minotaur wasn't born out of some ancient god's whim or vengeful rage like Medusa. No, this creature's origins are much more complex and much more tragic. The Minotaur was the product of a curse, a punishment, and the twisted intersection of human and divine desires. Born to the beautiful queen Pasiphae of Crete and a magnificent white bull, the Minotaur was the result of a terrible union, one that was never meant to be. Pasiphae had fallen in love with the bull after her husband, King Minos, angered Poseidon by refusing to sacrifice the beast. In retaliation, Poseidon cursed the queen, making her fall madly in love with the bull. From this unnatural union, the Minotaur was born. A half-man, half-bull creature that would live in isolation, hidden deep within a labyrinth so complex that even the gods couldn't navigate it. Historians and mythologists still debate the psychological implications of the Minotaur's creation. Was it simply an act of divine vengeance, or was it symbolic of the uncontrollable desires that can spiral out of control? Some see the Minotaur's birth as a representation of the consequences of unchecked lust, a cautionary tale about the dangers of ignoring the natural order. Others view it as a symbol of the ancient Greek fear of the monstrous, of things that don't belong, human and animal, divine and mortal. The Minotaur, after all, wasn't a natural being, it was a creature born out of twisted desires and divine punishment, living as a living contradiction. The Minotaur, however, wasn't just a tragedy, it was a terror. It lived in the labyrinth, a maze built by the brilliant craftsman Daedalus, specifically designed to house the creature. The labyrinth itself was a perfect reflection of the Minotaur's existence, complicated, winding, and endless. No one who entered the maze, not even the bravest of heroes, could escape unless they had help. And so, the Minotaur roamed freely within the labyrinth, waiting for the next group of unfortunate souls to wander in. The creature was fed a tribute of young Athenians every year, 7 boys and 7 girls, sent into the maze as part of a brutal and pointless tribute to King Minos. The Minotaur devoured them one by one, adding to his horrific legend. Historians and scholars are still fascinated by the symbolism of the Minotaur. Some believe the creature represents the fear of the primal, the savage side of human nature, which must be contained and hidden away, lest it break free. Others suggest that the labyrinth is a metaphor for the complicated, confusing nature of life itself, an intricate web of choices and consequences that no one can navigate without getting lost. But whatever the symbolism, the Minotaur was, and still is, one of the most terrifying figures in Greek mythology. And yet, despite the horror, there's another side to this tale. There's a hero in this story, Theseus, the Prince of Athens, who, with the help of Princess Ariadne, ventured into the labyrinth to kill the Minotaur. Ariadne gave Theseus a ball of thread, which he used to mark his path, ensuring he could find his way back once the beast was slain. Armed with nothing but his courage and a sword, Theseus entered the maze, and after a fierce struggle, killed the Minotaur. The creature's death marked the end of the sacrifices to the monster, but it also marked the beginning of Theseus's legacy as a hero of Athens. But the Minotaur, even in death, represents something darker, something terrifying in its very nature. The maze, the creature, and the sacrifices all speak to the ancient Greek worldview, where monsters weren't just physical beings, they were representations of chaos, primal forces that couldn't be controlled. The Minotaur, born of a curse and locked away in a maze, was a manifestation of the things in the world that couldn't be understood or tamed, things that demanded fear and tribute to keep at bay. What's truly unsettling, though, is that even though the Minotaur was slain, his story didn't end. Like many figures in mythology, his legacy endured. The labyrinth itself became a symbol of the complexities of life, the twists and turns that each person must face. And while the Minotaur may have been defeated by a hero, there's always another labyrinth waiting, another monster lurking in the dark corners of our fears. So, as you drift further into the depths of this tale, remember that the Minotaur isn't just a beast of flesh and bone. It's the fear of the uncontrollable, of those things in life that we cannot understand or conquer. It's a reminder that no matter how far we've come, there's always something lurking in the darkness, something that defies explanation and demands our respect. Whether it's a monster born of divine retribution, or simply the chaotic forces of nature, the Minotaur stands as a testament to the dark side of existence, always waiting just beyond the edge of our understanding. As you lie here in the darkness, already haunted by the Minotaur's maze and the primal fears it stirs, let's move deeper into the heart of Greek mythology, where things grow even darker. Next up is a creature whose very name still sends shivers down the spine: the Hydra. The Hydra was no ordinary monster. Unlike the Minotaur, who had brute strength and a tragic backstory, the Hydra was pure, unrelenting terror wrapped in a serpentine body. It wasn't just large, it was countless. The Hydra had 9 heads, though some myths claim it had as many as 100. Each time one of its heads was chopped off, 2 more would grow in its place. Imagine that. No matter how much you fought, no matter how many heads you severed, the creature only grew stronger, more fearsome, more impossible to defeat. The Hydra wasn't just a challenge for heroes. It was a perfect embodiment of an unstoppable, self-regenerating evil. It was the kind of monster that made even the gods feel powerless. Historians and scholars often debate the significance of the Hydra's immortality. Was it meant to symbolize an eternal evil, a force that could never truly be destroyed? Some argue that the Hydra represents the challenges in life that never seem to end, no matter how hard we try to solve them. It's the kind of monster that feels like an insurmountable problem, a nightmare that reappears no matter how many times you think you've conquered it. But others see the Hydra as a metaphor for the destructive nature of unchecked growth, the way a small problem can rapidly spiral out of control, becoming something far more dangerous than anyone initially imagined. The Hydra lived in the swampy waters of Lerna, a place where few dared to venture. It was there that the hero Heracles, or Hercules as he's known in Roman myths, was sent to tackle the creature as part of his 12 labours. The myth of the Hydra is famous for the impossibility of the task. Heracles, wielding his mighty club, could not simply hack at the Hydra and expect victory. Every head he cut off seemed to multiply the creature's power, leaving him to battle what appeared to be an endless, ever-growing nightmare. Historians argue about whether Heracles' fight with the Hydra was purely about physical strength, or whether it was a deeper allegory for overcoming challenges that seem insurmountable. Many scholars believe that the Hydra's regenerative ability was symbolic of the resilience of evil. It can never truly be wiped out, no matter how hard we try to eliminate it. Some even suggest that it reflects humanity's perpetual struggle against inner demons, addictions, or societal issues that reappear no matter how much we try to cut them off. But Heracles, being the hero he was, didn't give up. While the battle seemed hopeless at first, he realized that mere strength wasn't enough. His nephew Iolaus helped him by cauterizing the stumps of the decapitated heads, preventing them from regenerating. This act of teamwork, of thinking beyond brute force, was key to defeating the Hydra. Heracles eventually succeeded in killing the monster, but not without its consequences. The Hydra's blood, though deadly, became a powerful poison, which Heracles used to coat his arrows, making them even deadlier. This added layer to the myth suggests that while victory may come at great cost, it also leaves behind powerful tools for future challenges. So what does the Hydra teach us? At first glance, it might seem like a simple tale of heroism, a warrior slaying a giant, multi-headed monster. But look deeper and you realize that the Hydra represents the complexity of life's problems. It teaches us that evil, chaos, or even our personal struggles are not so easily dealt with. Cutting off one head might make it worse, but with patience, strategy, and sometimes help from others, we can find a way to overcome even the most terrifying of beasts. The Hydra shows us that we are often faced with the same recurring problems, but it also reveals that true heroism lies in persistence, creativity, and not just in defeating the beast in front of us, but learning to handle the consequences of the battle. And even though the Hydra was slain by Heracles, the battle remains one of the most iconic in Greek mythology. It's not just about the physical confrontation, it's about the mental, emotional, and spiritual endurance it takes to face something that feels undefeatable. It's about finding a way to win, even when every method you try seems to fail. So, as you settle further into the night, think about the Hydra's heads multiplying endlessly. Sometimes, the challenges you face feel like they're growing faster than you can manage. But remember, just like Heracles, you don't need to fight every battle with brute force alone. Sometimes, the answer lies in strategy, in asking for help, or simply in persevering through the seemingly endless struggle. It's not about how many heads the Hydra has, it's about how you face them. By now, the Hydra's endless heads and regenerative powers have likely left you pondering the persistent challenges in life. But as you settle deeper into the story, get ready for yet another creature that stirs both awe and terror. It's time to meet Cerberus, the three-headed guardian of the underworld. His role in Greek mythology wasn't to attack or destroy. No, Cerberus had a more subtle and frightening power. He was the keeper, the one who ensured that souls could never leave the realm of the dead. Imagine this: a massive, terrifying dog with 3 snarling heads, each one filled with sharp teeth and eyes that glowed with a menacing light. Cerberus's job was to stand at the gates of the underworld, watching over the dead, making sure no soul could ever escape. He was a creature of duty, a monstrous sentinel, and his terrifying bark was enough to send shivers down the spine of even the bravest of heroes. His sheer presence made the underworld feel even more foreboding, more inescapable. Historians still argue whether Cerberus was a figure of pure evil, or if he was just doing his job as instructed by the gods. Some see him as the embodiment of death itself, an inescapable fate that no mortal can avoid. Others argue that Cerberus was more like an enforcer of divine order, ensuring that the dead remained where they belonged. While some cultures viewed death with fear, in Greek mythology death was just another part of life, a force that could not be avoided. Cerberus, in his relentless duty, ensured that no one ever disrupted that eternal order. But here's the twist: though Cerberus was a fearsome guardian, he wasn't entirely invincible. Enter the hero Heracles again, who, as part of his 12 labours, was tasked with capturing Cerberus. Yes, the mighty guard dog of the dead had to be taken alive, a feat that seemed impossible to even the strongest of heroes. It wasn't enough to simply defeat Cerberus. Heracles had to subdue him without killing him, a challenge that required not just physical strength, but immense skill, strategy, and even a little bit of divine help. According to the myth, Heracles didn't fight Cerberus head-on with swords and shields. Instead, he relied on his incredible strength and his ability to outwit the beast. After battling his way through the underworld, Heracles managed to capture Cerberus by using no weapons, just his bare hands. And though the 3-headed dog fought back fiercely, Heracles' sheer determination allowed him to wrestle the creature into submission. The scene, as you might imagine, is intense. Picture the ground shaking as Cerberus roars in defiance, the force of his barks enough to rattle the gates of Hades itself. But Heracles, unyielding, manages to force Cerberus to his knees, successfully capturing the creature and bringing him back to the mortal realm. This labour was one of the most difficult of Heracles' 12, not only because of Cerberus' strength, but because it symbolized the hero's ability to overcome even death itself. By capturing Cerberus, Heracles was able to assert his dominance over death, showing that even the most fearsome forces could be tamed. It's a symbolic victory, one that reinforces the idea that death, though inevitable, doesn't have the final word, and while Cerberus is bound to guard the underworld forever, this story shows that nothing in the world of Greek myth is truly unconquerable, not even death. But let's dive deeper into Cerberus's role in the broader Greek mythological landscape. The fact that he was often seen as a creature of duty, never questioning his orders, reveals something essential about the Greek understanding of fate and mortality. Cerberus's role was clear. He didn't judge the dead, he simply ensured that the rules of the underworld were followed. In a way, his existence mirrored the ancient Greek worldview, that life, death, and everything in between was governed by forces much bigger than the individual. The gods, fate, and even creatures like Cerberus were part of the divine order that no mortal could change. Whether you were a hero, a king, or a commoner, your journey would eventually lead you to the gates of the underworld, and Cerberus would be there, keeping watch. It's also worth considering how Cerberus's portrayal changed over time. In earlier myths, he's a terrifying monster, but later stories start to show a softer side. In some tales, Cerberus is shown as a pet of Hades, and in others he's even depicted as a more tragic figure, one whose existence is bound by duty rather than malice. In any case, his presence in mythology is as constant as death itself, a reminder that the afterlife, though mysterious and distant, is always just beyond the horizon. And in the end, Cerberus remains one of the most enduring symbols of the ancient Greek view of the afterlife, a place where all souls must go, and where even the fiercest guardians are tasked with keeping order. As you lie here tonight, think of Cerberus, standing guard at the gates of the underworld. The darkness, the ominous growl, and the finality of his role. Nothing escapes. It's a reminder that some things in life are inevitable, and no matter how hard you try to resist, certain forces remain beyond your control. But even in the face of such inevitability, there's always a hero who dares to face it. A reminder that no matter how terrifying the monster, even Cerberus can be captured by those determined enough to face their fate. As the shadow of Cerberus looms large and the gates of the underworld close behind him, let's now slip further into the darkness, where monsters aren't always bound by the earth or the underworld, but by the sea. Here we meet Charybdis, no ordinary sea creature. This wasn't just a terrifying monster. Charybdis was a force of nature, a living whirlpool capable of swallowing entire ships in a single gulp. Imagine a massive maelstrom, churning with such power that it could drag everything into its depths. And that was Charybdis. She was the embodiment of the very seas themselves, unpredictable and deadly. Charybdis wasn't always this way. The tale of her transformation is as dark as the depths of the sea she inhabits. Once she was a beautiful sea nymph, beloved by the gods. But in a fit of greed, she tried to steal the land of Zeus, or at least his water. Zeus, not one to let any transgression slide, especially one that involved something as sacred as his domain, punished her. He turned her into a fearsome monster, a massive whirlpool that sucked in ships, sailors, and anything unfortunate enough to venture too close. From that moment on, Charybdis was doomed to endlessly churn the waters, creating whirlpools that swallowed ships, swallowing both the sea and its passengers. The historians and scholars debate the deeper meaning behind Charybdis's transformation. Some view her as a representation of the power and unpredictability of the sea, while others see her as a metaphor for excess and greed. Her story serves as a warning about the consequences of trying to take more than what is rightfully yours, about pushing too far and suffering a punishment that cannot be undone. Yet, unlike some of the other Greek monsters, Charybdis doesn't merely represent destruction. She is a reminder of nature's uncontrollable forces. In a way, Charybdis mirrors the way the ancient Greeks saw the world, chaotic, ever-changing, and full of dangers that could rise up at any moment without warning. The most famous story involving Charybdis occurs in the Odyssey, where the hero Odysseus faces the terrible dilemma of navigating between Charybdis and Scylla, a two-headed monster that lurked on the opposite side of a narrow strait. These two monsters, Charybdis, the deadly whirlpool, and Scylla, the fierce sea creature with 12 legs and 6 heads, represented the ultimate choice between two evil. In the Odyssey, Odysseus and his men must sail between them, knowing that no matter which way they turn, disaster is inevitable. And while the monster Scylla may have seemed the greater threat, it was Charybdis that loomed with a more insidious danger, an unrelenting force pulling them toward their doom. Historians still argue whether the tale of Charybdis reflects the ancient Greek fear of the unknown, or the understanding that life is full of dangers and there is no easy path to safety. Some scholars suggest that Charybdis represents the eternal struggle against nature's unpredictability, the unstoppable forces that can never be fully controlled. Others believe Charybdis is a symbol of inevitable fate. Just as a ship cannot escape a whirlpool once it's caught, humans cannot escape the forces of destiny once they are set in motion. And yet, despite all her terrifying power, Charybdis is not a creature of pure evil. She is a monster born from a mistake, a nymph cursed for her greed, and a reminder that even the forces of nature, which can seem monstrous and uncontrollable, are born from something as fragile as a mistake. Unlike some of the other monsters we've encountered, Charybdis isn't a creature of malice. She is a force of nature, as indifferent as the sea itself, unconcerned with who she destroys or why. Her only purpose is to exist, to churn the waters, to swallow anything unlucky enough to fall into her grasp. There's a bitter irony in Charybdis's story. While she is a threat to sailors and adventurers, she is also a mirror of their ambition. In the Odyssey, Odysseus and his men are forced to sail between the two monsters, Scylla and Charybdis. They know that either way they will suffer losses. Yet they must choose between the two dangers, and in doing so they face the inevitable. That sometimes in life there are no perfect choices, only those that are less disastrous than others. Odysseus, in his wisdom, decides to face Scylla, choosing to lose a few men rather than risk the total destruction that Charybdis would cause. In a sense, he's choosing between the lesser of two evils, acknowledging that fate cannot always be avoided. Sometimes, you just have to decide how you'll face the storm. As you sink deeper into this dark journey, think about Charybdis and the whirlpools she creates. Think of the forces that can pull you under no matter how hard you try to resist them. Charybdis reminds us that some things in life are beyond our control, unavoidable, like a force of nature. But like Odysseus, we too have to make choices, navigating between our personal Scyllas and Charybdises, deciding which danger to face and how to move forward. In the end, Charybdis with her eternal whirlpool teaches us that fate, much like the sea, can be unforgiving, and that sometimes survival isn't about fighting the storm, but about choosing how to ride the waves. Now that you've braved the depths of Charybdis and the tumultuous seas, let's ascend from the depths to meet another of the ancient Greek terrors, an enchanting yet deadly force. We're talking about the sirens. These creatures weren't made of flesh and bone alone. They were born from the very essence of temptation, wrapped in beauty, mystery, and death. The sirens lured sailors to their doom with their hypnotic songs. These enchanting voices called out across the water, promising untold pleasures and secrets. But their sweet melodies were a deadly trap, one that no sailor could resist. Imagine sailing through the foggy, dark seas, your crew on high alert. Then you hear it. The soft, melodic call, sweet and entrancing, promising paradise, bliss, and a sense of knowing the unknowable. The siren's song floated through the waves, so beautiful, so compelling, that no man could resist. The power they held wasn't in their physical forms, but in the seductive nature of their voices. It wasn't just a song, it was an invitation, a pull toward an inevitable end. Historians still debate the true meaning behind the sirens. Were they simply predators, using their beauty and song to feast on the souls of those they ensnared, or were they symbolic of something deeper? Many scholars suggest that the sirens represent the dangers of unchecked desires, the allure of something forbidden that, we know, deep down, will lead to our undoing. Their song, like so many temptations, is beautiful but deadly, symbolizing the way our desires can lead us astray if we don't control them. Others view the sirens as a representation of death itself, not as an active force, but as something that waits, silent and patient, only to strike when we are vulnerable. In the famous myth of Odysseus, the hero and his crew had to navigate the perilous waters near the sirens' home. The sirens weren't simply about the danger of death by drowning or crashing. They represented something more profound, the threat of losing control, of being drawn into a world of illusion, where reality no longer matters. To protect himself, Odysseus ordered his men to block their ears with beeswax so they couldn't hear the siren's song. However, he was too curious to resist, so he had himself tied to the mast of the ship, unable to move, unable to act on his impulse. As they sailed past the sirens, Odysseus begged his men to release him, to let him follow the sweet call, but they obeyed his earlier orders and ignored his desperate pleas. Historians often note how Odysseus's actions reflect the very nature of temptation. By tying himself to the mast, he was acknowledging the power of the siren's allure, but also demonstrating the necessity of self-control and discipline in the face of overwhelming temptation. He recognized that even the most heroic of men, when faced with such an enticing, irresistible force, might lose themselves. The key, as Odysseus understood, was to take preventative measures, making sure you can't act on your weaknesses before they even arise. But here's the thing. The sirens weren't simply trying to kill Odysseus or his men. They were offering a dangerous, illusionary escape from reality. Their song wasn't about death in the literal sense, but the death of reason, of willpower, of understanding. Their song promised knowledge of secret worlds, hidden truths, and eternal pleasures, but it also offered the end of any meaningful life. For the sirens, to be entranced was to be forever lost to a dreamlike state, where nothing mattered but the beauty of the illusion. Even after the sirens were defeated in Odysseus's myth, they didn't fade into obscurity. They represent a timeless danger, the temptation to follow something that promises bliss, but leads to nothingness. In a way, they are a metaphor for the desires that people face every day, those things that seem perfect, that call to us, but once we're drawn in, we realize too late that they were only traps. The sirens' power lies in their ability to make people think they're offering something worthwhile when, in fact, they're leading them to destruction. To this day, the tale of the sirens holds a powerful place in the human psyche. In a world full of distractions and temptations, be they the promise of fame, wealth, or fleeting pleasures, we still have to ask ourselves, what are we truly pursuing? The sirens serve as a reminder that there are always things in life that sound too good to be true, things that, if we're not careful, will lead us off course, away from our true path and towards something hollow. So, as you close your eyes tonight, think about the sirens and their sweet, deadly song. Think of the illusions we chase every day, the promises that seem too good to pass up. The key, just like Odysseus, is to know when to turn away, to protect yourself from the call of temptation and stay on course, no matter how sweet the song may sound. Because, in the end, the sirens are not simply a tale of monsters. They are a warning about the dangers that lie just beyond the horizon, waiting for the weak and distracted to stumble into their grasp. As the sweet, deadly song of the sirens fades into the night, we move deeper into the labyrinth of Greek mythology, where danger is no longer just in the form of beasts, but in the very hearts of men. This next creature is one that tests not only the physical strength of a hero, but also the limits of their mind. It's time to meet the Cyclops, the giants with a single terrifying eye, who lived in the remote corners of the world. These monstrous beings were not just physical threats. They represented the ancient fear of the unknown, of the untamable forces of nature that lurked just beyond the safety of civilization. The Cyclops were sons of Uranus and Gaia, and they were often portrayed as brutal, uncivilized creatures who lived without regard for the rules of gods or men. With their massive size and power, they roamed the wildest parts of Greece, hunting, creating, and occasionally destroying. However, the Cyclops weren't entirely without purpose. They were skilled blacksmiths and craftsmen, working for the gods themselves. In fact, it was the Cyclops who forged Zeus's thunderbolts, Poseidon's trident, and Hades's helmet of invisibility, making them invaluable to the gods. Despite their contributions, though, the Cyclops remained fearsome and unpredictable, their single eye symbolizing the focused and destructive nature of their power. One of the most famous Cyclops in Greek mythology was Polyphemus, the one-eyed giant encountered by Odysseus and his crew during their voyage home from the Trojan War. The encounter with Polyphemus is one of the most enduring stories in the mythological canon, showcasing both the brutality and the intelligence that the Cyclopes possessed. Polyphemus, who lived on an isolated island with his sheep, appeared to be a simple, uncivilized creature, but when Odysseus and his men stumbled upon his lair seeking food and shelter, they made a fatal mistake. They underestimated the Cyclops' cunning. Polyphemus, though monstrous, was not as simple as he seemed. He captured Odysseus and his men, trapping them inside his cave and devouring them one by one. His primal nature and brute strength made him nearly impossible to escape, but, as Odysseus often did in his adventures, he relied on his wits rather than his brawn. Realizing that brute force would not defeat the Cyclops, Odysseus devised a clever plan. He and his men got Polyphemus drunk on wine, and while the giant was passed out, they sharpened a large wooden stake. The next day, they drove the stake into Polyphemus's single eye, blinding him. This, however, was only part of Odysseus's clever strategy. Once the Cyclops was blinded, Odysseus and his men, still trapped in the cave, needed to find a way to escape. Using their wits again, Odysseus had the idea of hiding inside the sheep's wool as they were let out to pasture. Polyphemus, now blinded, could no longer see his captives, but as the sheep left the cave, Odysseus and his men hid under their bellies, slipping out unnoticed. It was a tale of both intelligence and resilience, where physical strength was no match for clever strategy. Historians often debate the deeper meaning of the Cyclops in Greek mythology. On one hand, they were symbols of uncivilized raw power, beasts who lived outside the rules of society and the gods. On the other hand, they were also a reflection of the ancient Greek understanding of isolation and the unknown. The Cyclops lived far away from civilization, in places where few ventured, and in many ways they represented the wild, untamed forces of nature that couldn't be tamed by human hands. They were primal and dangerous, but they were also a necessary part of the divine order, as the blacksmiths of the gods, crafting weapons of immeasurable power. The encounter with Polyphemus also serves as a reminder that, in mythology, no hero's journey is without consequence. While Odysseus outwitted Polyphemus, his actions led to dire consequences later in the story. Polyphemus, enraged by the blinding cursed Odysseus and his men, invoking the wrath of Poseidon, which caused Odysseus and his crew to face even greater challenges on their journey home. This idea of karma, of actions having unforeseen consequences, is a theme that runs throughout Greek mythology. The Cyclops, as terrifying as they were, also represented the clash between civilization and the untamed forces of nature. In Greek thought, civilization was not only about building cities and temples, but about controlling the chaotic elements of the world. The Cyclopes were creatures that existed beyond this order, and in many ways they were an embodiment of the dangers that lurk outside the boundaries of human control. But they also reminded the Greeks that, in times of crisis, it was often the cleverest mind that triumphed, not the strongest muscle. As you drift further into the depths of mythology, think about the Cyclops and the lessons they offer. They remind us that raw power and brute force, while impressive, are not always enough to overcome the challenges we face. Sometimes the key to survival lies in intelligence, in strategy, and in using our wits to outmaneuver those who seem invincible. The Cyclops, with their single, unblinking eye, might have seen everything in their world, but they missed one thing: the power of the human mind to adapt and overcome. And so, as you lay here tonight, consider the idea that not all monsters are defeated with swords and strength. Sometimes it's the quiet, thoughtful moments that make all the difference, the strategy that turns the tables in our favor. Like Odysseus, you too can face the impossible and emerge victorious, not by sheer force, but by thinking beyond the obvious and finding a way out when there seems to be none. As you feel the weight of the harpy's chaotic wings fade, imagine the world growing darker still, as we approach one of the most legendary and terrifying creatures in all of Greek mythology, the Chimera. A creature of many parts, the Chimera was more than just a monster. It was an amalgamation of the worst nightmares that ancient Greece could conjure up. A lion's head, a goat's body, and a serpent for a tail. This fearsome combination was more than just the sum of its parts. It was a beast that symbolized the unknown and the dangers of confronting something that should not, by any stretch of the imagination, exist. The Chimera wasn't the product of a single god's capricious whims, but rather a combination of the most terrifying aspects of nature. The lion, the king of beasts, symbolized strength, dominance, and ferocity. The goat, while less majestic, still represented stubbornness, independence, and a refusal to submit. And the serpent's tail, well, that was a symbol of death itself, with its venomous bite and ability to strike without warning. These elements together created a creature that was a true terror of the ancient world, a being that was as deadly as it was perplexing. How could something like this exist? How could anyone hope to defeat it? Historians and scholars debate the exact origin of the Chimera, and the symbolic meanings behind its grotesque form. Some suggest that it was a direct metaphor for chaos and disorder, a creature that represented the fragmentation of nature's order. The Chimera, in its very existence, challenged the boundaries of possibility. It was an abomination, a creature so far outside the realm of what should exist that it became a symbol of humanity's deepest fears, the fear of the unknown, the fear of creation gone wrong. Others argue that the Chimera's combination of elements represents the ancient Greek worldview of the interconnectedness of life and death, strength and weakness, nature and chaos. The Chimera embodied these contradictions, a being that was as beautiful as it was terrifying, as powerful as it was unnatural. The myth of the Chimera's defeat involves one of the greatest heroes of Greek mythology, Bellerophon, a mortal man whose legendary exploits rival those of the gods themselves. Bellerophon was not born into greatness, but he was destined for it. His journey began with his slaying of the Chimera, a task so daunting that it was considered impossible by many. To defeat such a beast, one would need more than strength and skill. One would need the will to face down a creature that was not only powerful, but also entirely unnatural. Bellerophon, however, had an advantage that many others did not: a divine companion in the form of Pegasus, the winged horse. The pairing of Bellerophon and Pegasus was no accident. In Greek mythology, horses were often symbols of freedom, power, and the journey between worlds. Pegasus, a creature born from the blood of Medusa, represented the untamed forces of nature. With wings that could carry him above any foe, he was a perfect match for the hero. The bond between Bellerophon and Pegasus allowed him to take to the skies and face the Chimera from a safe distance. In the myth, Bellerophon used a spear tipped with lead, which he launched at the Chimera from above. The Chimera, with its fiery breath, tried to attack, but Bellerophon, with his flying mount, was able to avoid its deadly strike. Eventually, the lead spear melted in the Chimera's fiery breath, and the molten lead poured into its throat, causing the beast to choke and die. The death of the Chimera was a significant victory, not just for Bellerophon, but for the idea of triumphing over the monstrous forces of chaos and disorder. In defeating the Chimera, Bellerophon proved that even the most terrifying creatures could be overcome with the right combination of courage, intelligence, and divine help. The Chimera, much like the Hydra or the Minotaur, represented an unstoppable force of nature. But like all monsters in Greek mythology, it had a weakness, a way to defeat it if one was clever enough to find it. Yet, as is often the case in Greek mythology, Bellerophon's victory over the Chimera did not mark the end of his story. His triumph, while glorious, was followed by a series of events that led to his eventual downfall. After slaying the Chimera, Bellerophon sought to fly to Mount Olympus, the home of the gods, riding Pegasus to the heavens. But this act of hubris, of trying to reach the realm of the gods, angered Zeus, who struck down Bellerophon and left him to wander the earth in misery for the rest of his days. The myth of Bellerophon is a classic example of the tragic hero's journey, where even great victories are tainted by the inevitable consequences of pride and overreaching. The Chimera itself, however, remains a potent symbol of the dangers of meddling with forces that are beyond comprehension. It was not merely a monster to be slain, it was a creature that represented the collapse of order. Just as the Hydra's heads could regenerate, and the Minotaur's labyrinth could never be fully escaped, the Chimera was a being that could never be fully understood. It was a creature born from the darkest corners of human imagination, a nightmare made flesh. And while Bellerophon's defeat of the Chimera was a triumph of heroism, it was also a reminder that the battle against chaos is never truly over. The Chimera, like many other creatures in Greek mythology, could be killed, but it would never truly disappear. It would live on in stories, in nightmares, and in the fears of those who confronted the unknown. As you settle into the comfort of your bed, think about the Chimera and what it represents. In life, we are often confronted by our own chimeras, those challenges that seem insurmountable, those fears that loom large in the distance, impossible to avoid. But just like Bellerophon, we have the ability to face them, to find a way to rise above the chaos. It might take intelligence, bravery, and help from unexpected sources, but the Chimera's defeat shows that nothing is truly unbeatable. And even when we win, even when we triumph over the monstrous forces in our lives, we must remember that pride, hubris, and overreaching can be just as deadly as the beasts we face. As the Chimera's chaos fades into the background, leaving behind echoes of heroism and hubris, we turn our gaze to the sea once more, but this time our story takes us deeper into the terror of ancient Greek mythology. This creature was not only a monstrous beast, but also one born of tragedy, despair, and transformation. We now find ourselves face to face with the infamous Scylla, the 12-legged, six-headed terror that lurked along the Strait of Messina, where sailors feared to tread. Scylla wasn't a creature of mindless rage like the Hydra, or a beast of punishment like the Harpies. No, she was a tragic figure, transformed into a monster, cursed by the gods, forever bound to her monstrous form. Scylla's story begins not with her monstrous nature, but with her beauty. She was once a stunningly beautiful sea nymph, beloved by sailors and gods alike. She lived happily, unaware of the jealousy and malice brewing in the hearts of the gods. That is, until Poseidon, the god of the seas, fell in love with her. However, her beauty didn't go unnoticed by Hera, Poseidon's wife, who, consumed with jealousy, sought to punish Scylla. In one version of the myth, Hera, in a fit of rage, transformed Scylla into a hideous monster with 12 legs and 6 heads, each lined with sharp, deadly teeth. But in another version, it was Glaucus, a sea god, who was infatuated with Scylla. When she rejected his advances, he sought the help of the sorceress Circe to win her over. However, Circe, also struck by Glaucus's affection, grew jealous and cast a curse on Scylla, turning her into the grotesque creature we know today. Historians and mythologists still argue over the nature of Scylla's transformation. Was she simply a victim of divine jealousy, or was she a metaphor for the destructive power of love and lust? Some scholars suggest that Scylla represents the uncontrollable forces of nature, the monsters that lurk in the natural world, waiting to emerge and claim their victims. Others view her as a symbol of the female experience, punished for rejecting a god's advances, just as women in myth often suffered for defying divine will. Either way, Scylla's transformation into a monster was tragic, and she would never return to her previous life, forever cursed to haunt the waters of the Strait of Messina, where sailors would pass at their peril. Scylla's very existence represented the deadly balance between order and chaos. She was a monster who existed at the intersection of these forces, a creature whose existence threatened the safety of sailors passing through the narrow strait. Just as Odysseus and his men faced her in their journey home, the sailors of the ancient world had to reckon with her deadly power. In the Odyssey, Odysseus, guided by the gods, was faced with a terrifying choice: to sail closer to Charybdis, the deadly whirlpool, or to risk passing near Scylla, whose multiple heads could seize and devour his men. Ultimately, Odysseus chose to sail near Scylla, knowing that the loss of a few men would be less disastrous than losing his entire ship to Charybdis. In the end, Scylla claimed 6 of his men, 1 for each of her heads. What makes Scylla particularly haunting is the duality of her nature. On the one hand, she is a symbol of terror, a creature whose very presence struck fear into the hearts of sailors, her many heads darting forward to snatch men from their ships. But on the other hand, she is a tragic figure, a woman transformed against her will, punished for crimes she didn't commit. Scylla's monstrous form, with 12 legs and 6 heads, might seem incomprehensible, but in Greek mythology, such transformations were not simply about punishment. They were often symbolic of deeper themes, of betrayal, of divine retribution, and of the inevitability of fate. Historians argue about the true nature of Scylla's curse. Some believe that she represents the uncontrollable forces of nature, the ancient Greek understanding that the sea was a realm both beautiful and deadly, capable of both nurturing and destroying. Others suggest that her story speaks to the power dynamics between men and women in Greek society, with Scylla being punished for defying the will of the gods, just as many women in mythology were punished for rejecting male desire. In either case, Scylla is a figure of fear, but also of pity. She is a monster, yes, but she is also a victim of the gods' whims, forced to live a life of destruction and isolation. The duality of Scylla's character is mirrored in the very nature of the sea itself. Beautiful, yet deadly, she is both a terror and a tragic figure, and that complexity makes her one of the most enduring monsters in Greek mythology. She embodies the paradox of nature itself. The same forces that can give life can also take it away in an instant. Scylla's story is not just one of monstrous transformation, but a reminder of the thin line between order and chaos, between beauty and destruction, and the terrible consequences that can arise when that line is crossed. As you reflect on Scylla's tragic transformation, think about how she represents the forces in life that seem both unavoidable and uncontrollable. Sometimes, like Odysseus, we find ourselves caught between two impossible choices, forced to make decisions that will lead to loss no matter what. Scylla's presence, though terrifying, is also a reminder that monsters don't always begin as monsters. Often, they are born from forces beyond our control. Whether that's divine punishment, jealousy, or the consequences of a world that demands sacrifice and suffering. In the end, Scylla remains one of the most compelling figures in Greek mythology. She is both monster and victim, both terror and tragedy, and much like the sea itself, her story is one that leaves an indelible mark on the soul, haunting, unforgettable, and impossible to fully escape. Now that the haunting image of Scylla and her many heads has taken its place in the shadows of your mind, we turn to another figure from the dark depths of Greek mythology, one that is often misunderstood, yet remains a powerful symbol of the mysterious and the unknown. Meet the Sphinx, one of the most enigmatic and deadly creatures to ever challenge mortals in ancient tales. The Sphinx wasn't just a creature of brute force or relentless hunger. No, she was a puzzle, a mystery wrapped in terror. With the body of a lion and the head of a woman, the Sphinx embodied both grace and fear, beauty and danger. But what made her truly terrifying wasn't her physical form, it was her mind. The Sphinx sat near the gates of Thebes, and she would challenge anyone who dared to pass her with a riddle. Fail to answer correctly, and she would devour you. There was no mercy, no reprieve, and no escape once the Sphinx posed her challenge. Her riddles were as elusive and tricky as the creature herself, designed not just to test intelligence, but to deceive and confound anyone who dared attempt an answer. The Sphinx had a deep sense of satisfaction in her ability to torment travelers, feeding off the terror she inspired and the helplessness of those who could not solve her riddles. Historians and mythologists have long debated the symbolic meaning of the Sphinx. Some suggest she represents the mystery of life and the inevitability of fate, the idea that we must all face challenges that seem insurmountable, but if we fail, there are consequences. The Sphinx's riddle, what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening, symbolizes the stages of human life. The answer, of course, is man. A baby crawls on all 4s, an adult walks on 2 legs, and in old age a person uses a cane, hence the 3rd leg. The riddle represents life's journey, its trials, and the knowledge that no matter how much we try, some puzzles in life are impossible to avoid. No mortal could pass without having to confront these mysteries. But other scholars argue that the Sphinx was a representation of human ignorance, an embodiment of the things we don't understand and the fear they bring. The Sphinx's presence in mythology then becomes a symbol of the unknown forces that shape our lives, forces that can destroy us if we fail to understand them. She was the unknown, the inescapable truth, lurking at the edges of the world of men, daring them to confront her with their wits. In a world where knowledge was power, the Sphinx reminded everyone that intelligence alone wasn't enough. You had to be able to see beyond the surface and understand the deeper layers of reality. But while the Sphinx was a terrifying obstacle for many, she was eventually outsmarted by a hero who would become one of the greatest figures in Greek mythology, Oedipus. The story of Oedipus and the Sphinx is one of the most famous and tragic in Greek legend. When Oedipus arrived in Thebes, the city was in chaos, suffering under the Sphinx's reign of terror. The riddle had stumped everyone who tried to answer it, and the Sphinx had devoured all those who failed. But Oedipus, with his keen intellect and quick thinking, was not daunted by her challenge. He solved the riddle, answering man with confidence, breaking the Sphinx's curse and freeing Thebes from her terror. The Sphinx, defeated and humiliated, threw herself off a cliff to her death. However, even in her death, the Sphinx's legacy endured, leaving behind a symbol of the dangers of human pride and the mysteries that we must eventually confront. Oedipus's victory over the Sphinx was not just a triumph of intellect, it was a reminder that we must be prepared to face the questions that life throws at us, even when the answers seem impossible to find. But as we all know, Oedipus's victory was not the end of his story. In fact, it marked the beginning of his tragic downfall, where the mysteries of his own life would be revealed in a much darker way. The Sphinx, in her puzzle and in her death, symbolizes the complex relationship between knowledge and power. She is not merely a monster, she represents the challenges that await us in life, the things we cannot predict and the mysteries we must unravel. And, much like Oedipus, we all eventually face these riddles, whether they come in the form of life's difficult choices, personal challenges, or the truths we must confront about ourselves. But there's another layer to the Sphinx's tale. Her very existence, her riddle, and her death all point to the Greek view of fate. The Greeks believed that the gods controlled the world, but they also believed that humans could alter their destiny through cleverness and bravery. Oedipus's success with the Sphinx, while a triumph of intellect, ultimately led him into a tragic destiny of his own making. It was his pursuit of truth, his need to solve the puzzle of his life, that would lead to his downfall. The Sphinx, in the end, was not just a monster to be defeated. She was a reflection of the inescapable mysteries that life holds, mysteries that can either be our salvation or our ruin. As you lie here, thinking of the Sphinx and her riddle, consider the many mysteries in your own life. What are the riddles you face, those challenges that seem impossible to solve, the puzzles that hold you captive? Like Oedipus, you might find answers, but remember that sometimes the truth is more complicated than it appears. The Sphinx's riddle, much like life itself, is a reminder that even when we think we understand the answers, there's always more beneath the surface, and sometimes that knowledge can change everything. As the Sphinx's riddle fades into the background, one of the most enigmatic and terrifying creatures in Greek mythology still awaits. The Sphinx was a creature of mystery, but now we turn to a being who is pure darkness. The Empusa. A creature that is as captivating as it is deadly, the Empusa is one of the more unusual and horrifying figures in ancient Greek lore. Unlike the towering monsters we've met so far, the Empusa wasn't a brute force or a terrifying beast. Instead, she was something much more subtle, more insidious. She was a vampiric seductress, a creature that used the allure of beauty to draw in her victims, only to consume them in a horrifyingly intimate way. The Empusa is most often depicted as a beautiful woman, but with one important and terrifying twist. She could change her form at will. This shape-shifting ability made her an even more dangerous predator, for she could take on the appearance of anyone, a trusted lover, a friend, or even the very person she was about to destroy. In some versions of the myth, she was said to have legs made of brass, while in others, she was described as having a single goat-like foot. Regardless of her appearance, however, her ultimate goal was always the same: to seduce and then devour. She would lure her victims into a false sense of security, promising them pleasure, only to reveal her true nature at the last moment. Historians still debate the true meaning of the Empusa in Greek mythology. Some view her as a metaphor for the dangers of unchecked desire and the way it can lead to destruction. Her beauty was not real, it was a mask, a facade designed to deceive and entrap. This deductive power was her weapon, and it made her as dangerous as any monster in Greek myth. The Empusa's very existence symbolizes the dark side of desire, the way it can consume us, lead us astray, and ultimately destroy us. Others suggest that she was a symbol of the dangers that lurk in the hidden, in the things that we don't understand or can't control. She was, in a sense, the embodiment of the things we don't know about ourselves or the world around us, and she used that ignorance to her advantage. The Empusa was often associated with the goddess Hecate, who, in Greek mythology, was the goddess of magic, witchcraft, and the night. Hecate was also a figure of liminality, existing between the realms of the living and the dead, the known and the unknown. The Empusa, as a follower of Hecate, was similarly a creature of liminality. She existed at the boundaries of life and death, and her ability to shapeshift represented the fluidity of identity, how one can appear to be something they are not, hiding their true nature beneath a mask of charm and allure. The Empusa is, in many ways, a reflection of the dangers of illusion, the way we can be fooled by outward appearances into trusting something or someone that ultimately leads to our destruction. Her role in Greek mythology was not just to hunt and kill, she was also a figure that spoke to the fragility of human perception. People often believed that they could see the world as it truly was, that they could trust the people they encountered. But the Empusa reminded them that appearances could be deceiving. Her beauty was a trap, and her seductive allure was a reflection of the way we can be led astray by our desires, mistaking what is fleeting for what is lasting, what is illusory for what is real. There's also a fascinating aspect of the Empusa that ties into the Greek understanding of death and the afterlife. Unlike other monsters who were associated with the physical world, like the Minotaur or Typhon, Empusa operated in the shadows, between worlds. She didn't simply kill, she consumed the very soul of her victims, taking away their life force in a way that left no trace behind. The Empusa was a reminder of the fragility of life, and her ability to blend into the human world made her an even more terrifying figure. She was a predator that could be anywhere, anyone, and you would never know it until it was too late. Her seduction of her victims was not just about sex or physical desire, it was also about the dangers of succumbing to things that promise pleasure, safety, or happiness, but ultimately lead to nothing but despair. The Empusa represents a perverse form of temptation, one that strips away the truth and leaves only emptiness in its wake. She was a creature that existed to remind the Greeks that sometimes the most dangerous things in life are not those that are overtly monstrous, but those that hide behind masks of beauty, charm, and allure. The Empusa's role in Greek mythology also serves as a cautionary tale. She reminds us that just as Odysseus had to face the riddle of the sirens, or Heracles had to face the fury of the Hydra, we too must face the dangers that lurk in the dark corners of our desires. The temptation to follow beauty, to seek pleasure without considering the cost, is always present. The Empusa warns us that sometimes what appears to be the answer to our deepest longings can turn out to be our undoing. As you lie here, drifting into the quiet of the night, consider the Empusa and her shape-shifting nature. The next time you encounter something that seems too good to be true, remember her beauty, her seduction, and her deadly intent. Life is filled with illusions, and sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones that look like our greatest desires. The key is to remember that not everything that glitters is gold. Like the Empusa, the things that deceive us often have hidden motives, waiting to pounce the moment we let our guard down. As the haunting image of the Empusa fades into the background of your mind, consider how seduction, in all its forms, can be as deadly as any monster. But now, we turn our gaze to a creature that is not just seductive in nature, but one that embodies the very essence of vengeance, the Lamia. The Lamia, like the Empusa, is a figure born of beauty and tragedy, but her tale is one of unimaginable heartbreak, transformed into monstrous wrath. Once a beautiful queen, Lamia's story is a tale of love lost and vengeance sought, and it's a myth that resonates deeply with the Greek themes of revenge and the destructive power of grief. Lamia was once the beloved consort of Zeus, and together they had many children, but when Hera, the jealous wife of Zeus, discovered Lamia's affair, she became consumed with rage. Hera, in a fit of divine fury, cursed Lamia, taking away the most painful thing she could, the lives of her children. Not only did Hera steal away Lamia's offspring, but she also transformed Lamia herself into a hideous, monstrous creature with the body of a serpent, forever cursed to hunt and devour the children of others.
The tragedy of Lamia's transformation is at the core of her myth. She was once a beautiful woman, cherished by Zeus, and in one cruel moment, all of that was taken away. Her grief over the loss of her children turned into an all-consuming rage, and in her new form, she became a creature of vengeance. She roamed the earth, luring children to her and devouring them, as though seeking to fill the empty void left by the deaths of her own children. The Lamia is the very personification of a mother's heartbreak, twisted and perverted by the god's cruelty into a monster of insatiable hunger. And historians still argue about the deeper symbolism behind Lamia's transformation. Some suggest she represents the destructive power of grief and loss, and how these emotions can transform a person into something monstrous when left unchecked. The ancient Greeks understood the power of revenge and the devastation that could come from it, and Lamia's story serves as a stark warning about the consequences of anger left to fester. Others see Lamia as a representation of the loss of innocence and beauty. She was a queen, a figure of grace, and by the gods' cruelty, she became a terror of the night, a symbol of how vengeance can erase beauty and replace it with something far darker. But Lamia's transformation wasn't simply a punishment, it was a reflection of the ancient Greek understanding of how emotions like jealousy, grief, and rage could lead to monstrous consequences. Lamia's curse wasn't only about her appearance, it was about what had been taken from her, and the cruelty of her curse was a reflection of the unjust suffering inflicted by Hera. Lamia's transformation from a beloved queen to a monster was not just about beauty lost, but about the unbearable weight of grief and the drive for vengeance that it created in her. The Lamia was not just a symbol of terror, but of the tragedy of what happens when pain turns into rage, when sorrow becomes an all-consuming force. What's fascinating about Lamia's story is the connection between her pain and the way she was viewed by the world. While many Greek myths feature gods and heroes who act as protectors, saviors, or figures of justice, Lamia is neither of those things. She is an outcast, a creature born from divine cruelty, forced to live in the shadows, forever estranged from the world she once knew. Her story reflects the darker side of Greek mythology, the side that shows us the monsters born from human emotions and experiences. Lamia, unlike Typhon or the Minotaur, wasn't a creature born of chaos or primal need. She was a victim, cursed by the gods, and turned into a monster by grief and loss. The Lamia's curse also extends to the idea of motherhood in Greek mythology, as many creatures in these myths are connected to divine forces of fertility, creation, and life. But Lamia's curse represents the opposite of this, the destruction of life, the stripping away of the maternal instinct, turning a mother into a monster that destroys rather than creates. Lamia's monstrous form became a reflection of the raw, unchecked power of her sorrow, making her a tragic figure in the Greek pantheon of monsters. Lamia's myth, like that of many other Greek monsters, is not just about the physical terror she brought to the world. It's also a reflection of the psychological terror of loss and vengeance. As her grief consumed her, she became a monster. But her monstrous nature was not just about the devouring of children. It was about the loss of innocence, the death of love, and the overpowering force of revenge. The ancient Greeks understood that vengeance, when allowed to fester, can destroy not only the object of anger, but also the person who holds that anger. Lamia, once a beautiful queen, became a terror, not just because of what she did, but because of what had been done to her. She was a monster not by choice, but by divine cruelty, forced into a role she had never asked for. And yet, in the darkness of the night, as Lamia prowled, there is a certain tragic beauty in her story. Her desire for revenge was not born out of evil intent, but out of a deep and unfathomable loss. She became a monster, but only because the gods took everything she loved, leaving her with nothing but sorrow and the need to fill the void with something. Lamia's myth, in the end, serves as a warning about the dangers of unchecked pain and the devastating consequences of vengeance. Her story reminds us that when grief turns into rage, when pain becomes all-consuming, it can twist a person into something unrecognizable, a being who can no longer control their actions. As you lie here tonight, think about Lamia and her transformation. The story of Lamia isn't just one of monsters, it's one of human emotions gone wrong, of how suffering can turn into a force so powerful that it consumes everything in its path. Lamia's myth serves as a reminder of how fragile we are in the face of grief and how dangerous it is to let that grief fester without finding a way to heal. While her story is one of destruction, it is also a reflection of the vulnerability of the human spirit and the monstrous consequences of pain when it is left unchecked. As Lamia's tragedy and vengeance settle into the depths of your thoughts, we come to the final chapter of our journey through the dark and twisted world of Greek mythology. It's time to confront the giants. Not mere monsters born of chaos, but colossal beings forged in the very fabric of the earth. The giants were no mere beasts. They were born of Gaia, the earth herself, and they represented the ultimate challenge to the gods of Olympus. This was no casual battle between mortals and monsters. The war between the giants and the Olympians was the last great conflict in Greek myth, and it's a story of epic scale. One that would determine the fate of the heavens, the earth, and everything in between. The giants were born out of Gaia's grief and fury after the defeat of her children, the Titans, by the Olympians. In revenge, Gaia birthed these massive beings to overthrow the gods. With their incredible strength, the giants were nearly unstoppable. They were described as towering figures, often with multiple arms or heads, each one more fearsome than the last. Their size and power made them a natural enemy of the gods, and their rebellion was fueled by a desire to reclaim the world for Gaia and herself. Historians still debate the symbolism of the giants in Greek mythology. Some argue that they represented the primal forces of nature, the wild, untamable elements that existed before the gods' rule. These were the forces that could not be controlled by the gods of Olympus, forces so powerful that even the gods would tremble before them. Others view the giants as a reflection of the ancient Greek understanding of hubris, the danger of overreaching and challenging the natural order of the world. The war between the giants and the Olympians, known as the Gigantaki, wasn't just a battle for power. It was a battle between the old world and the new, between the forces of chaos and the established order. The Battle of the Gigantaki was one of the most significant wars in Greek mythology. It was a war that would decide the fate of the cosmos, and it pitted the Olympian gods, led by Zeus, against the Titans' rebellious offspring. The giants were formidable enemies, but the Olympians had their own strengths. Zeus, with his lightning bolts, was the undisputed leader, and his siblings, Poseidon, the god of the sea, and Hades, the god of the underworld, fought alongside him, each contributing their powers to the fight. The gods were aided by several heroes, including Heracles, who played a crucial role in defeating the giants. With his incredible strength and bravery, Heracles helped turn the tide of battle, ensuring the victory of the Olympians. The battle was long and brutal, with both sides suffering tremendous losses. The giants, though powerful, were ultimately defeated. Their destruction wasn't just the result of brute force, it was also the result of clever strategy and divine intervention. In one version of the myth, the gods used the power of the earth itself against the giants. As Gaia's children fought against the gods, the Olympians called upon their allies, including the mighty Heracles, who used his wits and strength to defeat the giants. His role in the Gigantaki is one of the key moments in his legendary career. The gods ultimately prevailed, and the giants were cast down, banished to the depths of the earth. However, despite their defeat, the giants' legacy endured in Greek mythology. Their war against the gods was a symbolic struggle between order and chaos, civilization and nature. It was also a battle about the dangers of overreaching, of challenging the established order, and of defying the gods. The Gigantomachy represented the eternal conflict between these forces that are as old as the world itself, forces that continue to shape the human experience. The symbolism of the giants and their defeat serves as a reminder that no matter how powerful we become, there will always be forces that challenge us. In Greek mythology, the giants represented those forces, those primal, untamable elements that lie just beyond the reach of civilization. And though the gods of Olympus triumphed, their victory came with a price. The war with the giants forever changed the course of history. It reinforced the gods' dominance, but also showed them the vulnerability of their power. Even the Olympians, in all their glory, had to struggle to maintain their rule. The story of the giants is also a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, heroes can emerge. Heracles, with his strength and determination, was able to turn the tide in the gods' favor. He represents the idea that no matter how impossible the battle may seem, there is always a way to overcome adversity, whether it's through strength, strategy, or sheer willpower. And though the giants were defeated, their struggle reminded the Greeks of the ever-present tension between chaos and order, nature and civilization. So as you lay here tonight, think about the battle between the Olympians and the giants. It was a battle not just for power, but for the very nature of the world itself. The giants, with their raw power, challenged the gods, but it was the gods' wisdom and teamwork that ultimately led to victory. The gigatomachy reminds us that there will always be forces that seek to challenge the status quo, forces that demand our attention, our energy, and our resolve. But just like the Olympians, we too can face these forces, overcome them, and emerge victorious. And like Heracles, we may find that our greatest strengths lie not just in our power, but in our ability to navigate the complexities of the world and find a way through even the most daunting challenges.